What was the War of Reform?
It was the period in Mexican history from 1858 to 1861 when the Federalist government collapsed and civil war ensued. In 1858 President Ignacio Comonfort, 1812 to 1863, who had become Mexico's leader when he helped overthrow President Antonio López de Santa Anna, 1794 to 1876, in 1855, felt political pressure and fled the country. Benito Juárez, 1806 to 1872, who had served as Minister of Justice and Minister of the Interior, assumed the presidency. His position was immediately opposed by Centralists who rallied around rebellious army forces. Under this pressure, the Federalists, led by Juárez, withdrew from Mexico City and set up the capital at Veracruz, on the Gulf Coast. There they had control over customs receipts, which allowed them to purchase arms and finance their government. Eventually they defeated the Centralists and re-entered Mexico City in January 1861. Juárez was elected president later that year, but his authority was challenged again with the arrival of the French, who quickly put Maximilian, 1832 to 1867, in power as Emperor of Mexico. Juárez led the country in a successful campaign against the French, who were expelled in 1867 when Juárez resumed the presidency. He died in office in 1872.
What caused the Mexican War?
The two-year war, 1846–48, was fought over the United States annexation of Texas. The events that led up to the conflict began in 1837 when President Andrew Jackson, 1767–1845, recognized Texas as independent. This was just after Texas had won its war with Mexico. Republic of Texas President Sam Houston, 1793–1863, felt that protection against a Mexican invasion may be necessary, so he eyed annexation to the United States. In the meantime, Mexican President Antonio López de Santa Anna, 1794–1876, warned that such an action on the part of the United States would be equivalent to a declaration of war against the Mexican Republic. In June 1844 the U.S. Senate rejected a proposed annexation treaty. But later that year Democratic Party nominee James K. Polk, 1795–1849, an ardent expansionist, was elected president. Because the annexation of Texas had figured prominently in his campaign platform, outgoing President John Tyler, 1790–1862, viewed Polk's victory as a public mandate for annexation, and he recommended that Congress pass a joint resolution to invite Texas into the Union. Congress did so in February, and President Tyler signed the resolution on March 1, 1845. 3 days before leaving office, Mexico responded by breaking off diplomatic relations with the United States. A border dispute made the situation increasingly tenuous. Texas claimed that its southern border was the Rio Grande River, while Mexico insisted it was the Nueces River, situated farther north. In June, President Polk ordered Brigadier General Zachary Taylor, 1784–1850, to move his forces into the disputed area. In November, the U.S. government received word that Mexico was prepared to talk. Polk dispatched Congressman John Slidell, 1793–1871, to Mexico to discuss three other outstanding issues: the purchase of California, for $25 million, the purchase of New Mexico, for $5 million, and the payment of damages to American nationals for losses incurred in Mexican revolutions. This last point was critical to the negotiations, as Polk was prepared to have the United States assume payment of damages to its own citizens in exchange for Mexico's recognition of the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas. But upon arrival in Mexico City, Slidell was refused the meeting. President José Joaquim Herrera, 1792–1854, had bowed to pressure, opposing discussions with the United States. When Polk received news of the scuttled talks, he authorized General Taylor to advance through the disputed territory to the Rio Grande. Meanwhile, Mexico overthrew President Herrera, putting into office the fervent nationalist General Mariano Paredes y Arrillaga, 1797–1849, who reaffirmed Mexico's claim to Texas and pledged to defend Mexican territory. While Polk worked through Slidell to get an audience with the Mexican government, the attempts failed. And on May 9 the cabinet met and approved the president's recommendation to ask Congress to declare war. The next day news arrived in Washington that on April 25 a sizable Mexican force had crossed the Rio Grande and surrounded a smaller American reconnaissance party. 11 Americans were killed and the rest were wounded or captured. On May 11 Polk delivered a message to Congress, concluding, "Mexico has shed American blood upon the American soil. War exists, by the act of Mexico herself." By the time the war was officially declared, on May 13, just more than 1 year after Polk had been sworn into office, General Taylor had already fought and won key battles against the Mexicans and had occupied the northern Mexico city of Matamoros.
What did President George H. W. Bush mean when he said the U.S. had to draw a line in the sand?
President George H. W. Bush, 1924, was reacting to Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein's 1937 act of aggression when on August 2, 1990, his troops invaded neighboring Kuwait. The United Nations, UN, gave Iraq until January 15, 1991, to withdraw from Kuwait. Iraq failed to comply. The line in the sand that Hussein crossed was soon defended. On January 16, 1991, Operation Desert Storm was launched to liberate the Arab nation of Kuwait from Iraq. whose military dictator had not only invaded Kuwait but proclaimed it a new Iraqi province. Bush averred, "This will not stand," and in order to protect U.S. oil supplies in the country, the president mobilized U.S. forces, which were joined by a coalition of 39 nations, to soundly and quickly defeat Iraq.
When did American poetry begin?
As the self-described poet of democracy, Walt Whitman, 1819 to 1892, was the first to compose a truly American verse, one that showed no references to European antecedents, throwing off both the narrative and ode forms of verse, and that clearly articulated the American experience. His first published poetry was the self-published collection Leaves of Grass, 1855. In an effort to gain recognition, Whitman promptly sent a copy to the preeminent man of American letters, Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803–82, who could count as his acquaintances and friends the great British poets William Wordsworth, 1770–1850, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 1772–1834, the renowned Scottish essayist Thomas Carlyle, 1795–1881, and prominent American writers Henry David Thoreau, 1817–1862, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, 1804–1864. It was a bold move on Whitman's part, but it paid off, while Leaves of Grass had been unfavorably received by reviewers. Emerson composed a 5-page tribute, expressing his enthusiasm for the poetry and remarking that Whitman was at the beginning of a great career. Thoreau, too, praised the work. More than a century later, biographer Justin Kaplan acclaimed that in its time Leaves of Grass was the most brilliant and original poetry yet written in the New World. At once the fulfillment of American literary romanticism and the beginnings of American literary modernism. Whitman's well-known and frequently studied poems include Song of Myself, O Captain, My Captain, Song of the Open Road, and I Sing the Body Electric. While she was virtually unknown for her poetry during her lifetime, Emily Dickinson, 1830–1886, was writing at about the same time as Whitman, the 1850s, publishing only a handful of poems before her death. Collections of Dickinson's works were published posthumously, and today she, too, is regarded as one of the great early poets of the United States. Had more of her work been brought out in print, perhaps she would have been recognized as the first truly American poet.
How old is tennis?
The game is believed to have originated in France, where it was called jeu de paume, meaning game of the palm, in the 1100s or 1200s. Players hit a small ball back and forth over a net using the palms of their hands. The father of modern tennis is English soldier and sportsman Walter Clopton Wingfield, known as Major Wingfield 1833–1912. who in 1873 published a rule book for lawn tennis and in 1874 patented equipment for the game.
What was Y2K?
Y2K means year 2000, K is a metric abbreviation for thousand. In the late 1990s the term was most often coupled with problem or bug to refer to a potentially disastrous computer programming peculiarity. Over decades of programming and in trillions of lines of code, developers had truncated the 4-digit year to 2 digits as a space-saving mechanism, so that 1999 was rendered as 99. It was therefore feared that many computer programs, as well as simple chips in VCRs, watches, and other consumer devices, might malfunction, reading 00 not as 2000 but as 1900, or not recognize it at all. The problem was a concern for every sector of the global economy, but it was feared to have a particularly ruinous impact on the mainframe computer systems that are the backbone of operations for banks and other financial institutions. Electric utilities, water systems, communication systems, oil and gas companies, and government entities, such as the Department of Defense and the Social Security Administration. In the second half of the 1990s, business and government developed solutions to the Y2K problem. Or the millennial bug, readiness was gauged periodically to encourage the sharing of best practices across and between industries. The federal government passed the year 2000 Information and Readiness Disclosure Act, signed October 1998. Despite assurances that the Y2K bug had been fixed, much of the public met the year 2000 with at least a bit of trepidation, some people having made emergency preparations, such as stocking up on food and water, buying generators, and stashing away cash. Though there were isolated glitches, no major problem surfaced. Thanks to rectification efforts, the foretold Y2K crisis never materialized. But the cost of fixing the problem was high. It had an estimated $1.5 trillion price tag.
Why is Jane Austen widely read today?
Austen is considered one of the greatest novelists in English. She wrote just 6 books during her lifetime, including her best-known works Sense and Sensibility. Published 1811, Pride and Prejudice, 1813, and Emma, 1816. But in so doing she created the novel of manners, which continues to delight readers today. The daughter of a clergyman, Jane Austen, 1775 to 1817, rejected the literary movement of the day. Romanticism, opting instead to portray life as she knew it. As such, she was the first realist in the English novel. Austen's works are ripe with shrewd observation, wit, and an appreciation for the charms of everyday life, making her an engaging storyteller for all time.
What is rag money?
Rag money is a derisive term for paper currency. The name comes from the early days of paper money, when paper itself was predominantly made with the cotton and linen fibers from rags. Hence, bills were rag money. Given that valued currency was issued in silver or gold coins by the established governments of Europe, it is not surprising that Americans greeted paper currency, which is nothing more than a promise of future payment in coin, as something to be regarded with skepticism. After the Declaration of Independence, 1776, the first bills that were issued by the U.S. government quickly became worthless. In its effort to fund the American Revolution, 1775–83, the Second Continental Congress printed so many bills, called Continentals, that there was not enough silver to back them up. The financial crisis that emerged did nothing to inspire American confidence in paper currency. Rag money continued to have its detractors even after the revolution had been financed by European loans, and the U.S. government established the dollar as its unit of currency, 1785.
How old is the calendar?
The calendar that is in general use today is the Gregorian calendar. It dates to 1582, when Pope Gregory XIII, 1502–1585, asked for a revision of the Julian calendar. That calendar is named for its initiator, Julius Caesar, 100–44 BC. Who in about 46 BC commissioned the astronomer Sosigenes of Alexandria to develop a universal solar calendar to be used throughout the Roman Empire. As Roman armies conquered more and more territory, the empire included many peoples and differing calendars, including the lunar-based Roman calendar. The Julian calendar consisted of a year of 365 days, with one day added every fourth year, leap year. When the year is divisible by 4, to compensate for the fact that the solar year is really 365.25 days. It had 12 months, each of 30 or 31 days except February, which had 28, and the new year began on January 1st. The Gregorian calendar retained these features but revised the Julian to bring the Christian celebration of Easter in alignment with the vernal equinox, first day of spring. It also dropped leap years for any century year not divisible by 400, an effort to keep the solar calendar in line with the seasons. For example, 1900, though divisible by 4, was not a leap year since it was a centenary year not divisible by 400. The year 2000, divisible by 400, was a centenary leap year.
Where does golf sensation Tiger Woods rank among the greats?
Woods, 1975, ranks among the best players of all time. In 1999 he won 8 tournaments, including the Professional Golfers Association, PGA and Tour Championships, and he was the first player to win 4 consecutive starts since Ben Hogan. 1912 to 1997, in 1953, Hogan won a total of 5 tournaments that year. In 2000 Woods went on to win 9 tournaments, and in 2001 and 2002 he had 5 wins each season, giving him a total of 27 wins in 4 years. In July 2005, with his victory at the British Open, Woods became only the 5th player in golf history to complete a career Grand Slam, winning golf's 4 major tournaments: the Masters, the US Open, the British Open, and the PGA Championship. In 2001 he became the first player to consecutively win the Grand Slam. This impressive run alone assures Woods a place in the annals of golf history. As of mid-2005, Arnold Palmer, 1929, remained the PGA leader for the number of wins in any 4-year period. Between 1960 and 1964 he racked up 29 first-place finishes. He was also the first player to win the Masters 4 times, 1958, 1960, 1962, and 1964. A couple of other legendary names in golf tallied record numbers of wins in short periods to dominate the sport. Ben Hogan won 30 tournaments in 3 seasons, 1946-48, and Byron Nelson, 1912. Won 26 tournaments in just 2 years, 1944 and 1945. Sam Snead, 1912-2002, and Jack Nicklaus, 1940. Dominated the sport over the course of decades. Snead holds the record for the most wins in a career, 81. And Nicklaus follows with 71. At the age of 24, Woods was already the PGA's career earnings leader. To put this in perspective, in 1999 he won $1 million more for the year than golf legend Jack Nicklaus made in his entire PGA Tour career. Woods' ability and appeal combined to help raise earnings overall for the sport. He was credited with expanding golf's horizons by bringing new fans to the game. According to ESPN The Magazine, ratings for the final round of each of the 4 majors collectively jumped 56% in 1997 when Woods broke the Masters scoring record. He shot 270 over 72 holes to finish 12 strokes ahead of the second-place winner. At the end of the 2004 season and despite a slump, Woods remained on top for career earnings. But he was followed very closely by Vijay Singh, 1963.
How old is country music?
Old-time music or hillbilly music, both early names for country music. Emerged in the early decades of the 1900s. By 1920 the first country music radio stations had opened. And healthy record sales in rural areas caused music industry executives to take notice. But it was an event in 1925, in the middle of the American jazz age, that put country music on the map. On November 28, WSM Radio broadcast the WSM Barn Dance. which soon became known as the Grand Ole Opry when the master of ceremonies, George D. Hay, took to introducing the program that way since it was aired immediately after an opera program. The show's first performer was Uncle Jimmy Thompson, 1848 to 1931. Early favorites included Uncle Dave Macon, 1870 to 1952, who played the banjo and sang, and Roy Acuff, 1903 to 1992, who was the Opry's first singing star. Millions tuned in, and soon the Nashville-based show had turned Tennessee's capital city into music City, USA. In the 1960s and again in the late 1980s and 1990s, country music reached the height of popularity. While holding on to its small-town, rural-based audience who were the show's first fans.
What are the four humors?
The four humors are the bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, originating in the heart, brain, liver, and spleen, respectively. One work assigned to Greek physician Hippocrates, c. 460 c. 377 BC, Nature of Man, asserts that illness is caused by an imbalance of the four humors, fluids, in the body. The presence of these humors was thought to determine the health and personality of a person. This belief prevailed for centuries but was finally discredited by modern science. During the Middle Ages, 500-1350, each of the humors was assigned certain characteristics. Someone of ruddy complexion was believed to have an excessive amount of blood in his or her system. That person would be sanguine, cheerful and optimistic in character. The word sanguine is derived from the Latin word sanguis, meaning blood. Someone who had an imbalance resulting in more phlegm was considered phlegmatic, and would have a slow and impassive temperament. An individual who had excessive yellow bile was considered hot-tempered, and a person who had more black bile in his or her physiological system was believed to be melancholic.
How did the House of Windsor originate?
The origins of Windsor, the family name of the Royal House of Great Britain, can be traced to the 1840 marriage of Queen Victoria, who ruled from 1837 to 1901, to her first cousin Albert, the son of the Duke of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, in present-day Germany. As a foreigner, Prince Albert had to overcome the distrust of the British public, which he did by proving himself to be a devoted husband to Queen Victoria and by demonstrating his genuine concern in Britain's national affairs. Victoria and Albert had 9 children. Their oldest son, Albert Edward, 1841 to 1910, became King Edward VII upon Victoria's death in 1901. But Edward's reign lasted only until 1910, when he died and his son, George V, 1865 to 1936, ascended the throne. George was king during World War I, 1914–18, and, in 1917, with Britain and Germany bitter enemies. He denounced his ties and claims to Germany, superseding his grandfather's. Prince Albert's, family name of Wettin and establishing the House of Windsor.
What was the Johnstown flood?
The city of Johnstown, in southwest Pennsylvania, east of Pittsburgh, has been the site of numerous floods, but the most disastrous one occurred on May 31, 1889, when the South Fork Dam on the Conemaugh River gave way, releasing a torrent of water. Since the dam was located some 14 miles into the Allegheny Mountains, the waters rushed into Johnstown at a rate of 50 miles per hour. The water hit with a force strong enough to have tossed a 48-ton locomotive 1 mile. It killed more than 2,000 people, some sources place the estimate as high as 5,000 lives lost. At the time of the flood, the city's population was about 30,000. Meaning between 6 and 16% of the population died as a result of the disaster. In 1977, Johnstown was again the site of a disastrous flood. Though advance warning systems helped minimize the loss of life to 77.
Who was Rasputin?
Grigory Rasputin, 1872–1916, was a Russian mystic and quasi-holy man who rose from peasant farmer to become advisor to Tsar Nicholas II, 1868–1918, and his wife, Tsarina Alexandra, 1872–1918. Sometime in 1905 or shortly thereafter, Alexandra had come into contact with Rasputin, and, showing he was able to effectively treat Nicholas's and Alexandra's severely hemophiliac son Alexis. 1904–1918, Rasputin quickly gained favor with the Russian rulers. But the Prime Minister and members of the Legislative Assembly, the Duma, could see Rasputin was a disreputable character, and they feared his influence on the Tsar. They even tried to exile Rasputin, but to no avail. By 1913, 1 year before the outbreak of World War I, 1914–18, the Russian people had become acutely aware of Tsar Nicholas's weaknesses as a ruler. Not only was his government subject to the influence of a pretender like Rasputin, but the events of Bloody Sunday had irreversibly marred the Tsar's reputation. That year the Romanov dynasty was marking its 300th anniversary. Members of the royal family had ruled Russia since 1613. But public celebrations, intended to be jubilant affairs, were instead ominous, as the crowds greeted Nicholas's public appearances with silence. Russia's entry into World War I proved to be the beginning of the end for Nicholas. With Rasputin at the front and center of the controversy that swirled around the royal court. During the first year of fighting against Germany, Russia suffered one military catastrophe after another. These losses did further damage to the Tsar and his ministers. In the fall of 1915, urged on by his wife, Nicholas left St. Petersburg and headed to the front to lead the Russian troops in battle himself. With Alexandra left in charge of government affairs, Rasputin's influence became more dangerous than ever. But in December 1916, a group of aristocrats put an end to it once and for all when, during a palace party, they laced Rasputin's wine with cyanide. Though the poison failed to kill Rasputin, the nobleman shot him and deposited his body in a river later that night. Nevertheless, the damage to Nicholas and Alexandra had already been done. By that time virtually all educated Russians opposed the Tsar, who had removed many capable officials from government office, only to replace them with the weak and incompetent executives favored by Rasputin. The stage had been set for revolution.
Who were the Normans?
The Normans, like the Danes, originated in Scandinavia and were Vikings. In the mid-800s they invaded northern France, ousting the Franks who had conquered the region 400 years earlier. There they stayed, in the region that came to be known as Normandy, or Normandy. In 1066 the Norman Duke William, the Conqueror, 1027 to 1087, sailed across the Channel and claimed the English throne, uniting Normandy with the English kingdom. This arrangement lasted until 1204 when French King Philip Augustus, 1165 to 1223, reclaimed the territory. England took it back during the 15th century. But in 1450 Normandy was permanently restored to France, becoming a province. Norman descendants still live there today, and their influence is also evident across the English Channel, where the Norman nobility intermixed with the Anglo-Saxons.
What were Captain Cook's discoveries?
British navigator Captain James Cook, 1728 to 1779, was one of the world's greatest explorers. Commanding 3 voyages to the Pacific Ocean and sailing around the world twice. From 1768 to 1771, aboard the ship Endeavour, Cook conducted an expedition to the South Pacific, where he landed in Tahiti, and made the first European discovery of the coasts of New Zealand, Australia, and New Guinea, which he also charted. In 1772 Cook set out to find the great southern continent that was believed to exist. He spent 3 years on this voyage, which edged along the ice fields of Antarctica. On his last voyage, which he undertook in 1776 on a mission to find a passage around North America from the Pacific, Cook charted the Pacific coast of North America as far north as the Bering Strait. He met his death in 1778 on the Hawaiian Islands. Cook's voyages led to the establishment of Pacific Ocean colonies by several European nations.
What were the Boer Wars?
They were conflicts between the British and the Afrikaners, or Boers, who were Dutch descendants living in South Africa. At the end of the 19th century in what is today South Africa. The First War, a Boer rebellion, broke out in 1880 when the British and the Afrikaners fought over the Kimberley area. Griqualand West, where a diamond field had been discovered. The fighting lasted a year, at which time the South African Republic, established in 1856, was restored. But the stability would not last long. In 1886 gold was discovered in the Transvaal. And though the Afrikaner region was too strong for the British to attempt to annex it, they blocked the Afrikaners' access to the sea. In 1899 the Afrikaner republics of the Orange Free State and the Transvaal joined forces in a war against Britain. The fighting raged until 1902, when the Afrikaners surrendered. For a time after the Boer War, also called the South African War, the Transvaal became a British Crown colony. In 1910 the British government combined its holdings in southern Africa into the Union of South Africa.
What happened to the hippies?
The conflict in Vietnam ended, flower children grew older. Drugs took their toll on some, and by 1980 there was no such thing as free love. Still, a few continued to lead an alternative lifestyle. While at the opposite end of the spectrum others bought back into the establishment. Still others adapted their flower child beliefs to the ever-changing world around them and got on with their lives. Working at jobs and raising children in the most socially and politically conscious way possible.
Why is the Globe Theatre famous?
The Globe is known because of William Shakespeare's, 1564 to 1616, involvement in it. In the 1590s an outbreak of the plague prompted authorities to close London theatres. At the time Shakespeare was a member of the Lord Chamberlain's Men, an acting company. With other members of the troupe, he helped finance the building of the Globe. On the banks of the Thames River, which opened in 1599 as a summer playhouse. Plays at the Globe, then outside of London proper, drew good crowds. And the Lord Chamberlain's Men also gave numerous command performances at court for King James. By the turn of the century, Shakespeare was considered London's most popular playwright. And by 1603 the acting group, whose summer home was the Globe Theatre, was known as the King's Men.
Have all nations of the world granted women the right to vote?
No, in a few nations women remain disenfranchised. By the 1990s, women had a legal right to vote everywhere in the world except in 6 Middle Eastern countries: Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, Qatar, and United Arab Emirates, as well as in Brunei, a small oil-rich country in Southeast Asia. In 2001, Bahrain extended equal voting rights to women, and in 2003 Qatar did the same. But a traditional interpretation of Islamic law kept Muslim women from voting in a few conservative Persian Gulf states. Kuwaiti lawmakers proposed limited women's suffrage in spring 2005, but the measure was not approved. There was mounting pressure, from inside and outside the Muslim world, for this to change. The issue was an important focal point for the Human Rights Watch, an international watchdog group. In October 2004, a high-ranking Egyptian cleric spoke out on the contentious issue, saying, "It is the right of a Muslim woman to vote for and speak her opinion about whoever serves public or greater interests." He went on to clarify that he was talking about Muslim women in all Muslim countries, in Egypt, Kuwait, and others. Suffrage for women has been won country by country and decade by decade. Further, within many countries, rights have been extended only gradually. For example, beginning with local elections. The first nations to extend broad voting rights to women were New Zealand in 1893, Australia, and South Wales in 1902, and Finland in 1906. In the 1910s, women in several European and Scandinavian nations, including Austria, Denmark, Germany, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, and Russia, won the right to vote largely as a result of World War I, 1914-18. The 1920s added not only the United States and the United Kingdom to a voting status equal to men, but about a dozen other nations, including the former Czechoslovakia and Sweden. Every decade since added more nations to the tally, so that as of 2004 only a few nations denied women the right to vote.
What is the difference between the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament?
The Hebrew Bible is made up of 24 books. The Old Testament used by Christians consists of the same books as those of the Hebrew Bible, but they are arranged differently and many books are divided, resulting in more books in the Old Testament than in the Hebrew Bible. Among Christians, the Old Testament varies between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. Protestants include 39 books in the Old Testament while Roman Catholics add 7 books, called the Apocrypha, to their version, for a total of 46 books. The books of the Apocrypha resemble those of the Old Testament, but since they were written later than most of the Old Testament, probably 300 BC/AD 70, both Protestants and Jews treat them separately. The Bibles used by all three religions, Judaism, Roman Catholicism, and Protestantism, begin with the same 7 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Judges. The first 5 of these were written by Moses.
Who was John Peter Zenger?
John Peter Zenger, 1697–1746, was a New York City printer who was accused of seditious libel in 1735. His case changed the definition of libel in American courtrooms and laid the foundation for freedom of the press. The German-born Zenger immigrated to the American colonies in 1710, when he was 13 years old. He found a job as a printer's apprentice, working on the colony's official newspaper, the New York Gazette. 15 years later he began his own operation, which was mostly concerned with printing religious pamphlets. In 1733 New York received a new colonial governor from England. William Cosby quickly earned the contempt of the colonists, both rich and poor. Prosperous businessmen who opposed Cosby and his grievous tactics approached Zenger, offering to back a newspaper that he would both edit and publish. Zenger agreed, and on November 5, 1733, the first issue of the weekly journal was released. It included scathing criticisms of the royal governor, raising Cosby's ire. After burning several issues of the papers, Cosby had Zenger arrested in November 1734. The editor-publisher continued to operate the journal from inside his jail cell, dictating editorials to his wife through the door. Zenger's case went to trial in August 1735. Prominent Philadelphia attorney Andrew Hamilton, 1676–1741, considered the best lawyer in the colonies, came to Zenger's defense. Hamilton admitted his client was guilty of publishing the papers, but, he argued, that in order for libel to be proved, Zenger's statements had to be both false and malicious. The prosecution contested the definition of libel, asserting that libelous statements are any words that are scandalous, seditious, and tend to disquiet the people. The court agreed with the prosecution, and Hamilton was therefore unable to bring forth any evidence to support the truth of the material Zenger printed in the weekly journal. The defense argument was not heard until the closing statement was made by Hamilton. His summation stands as one of the most famous in legal history. He accused the court of suppressing evidence, urging the jury to consider the court's actions as the strongest evidence, and went on to declare that liberty is the people's only bulwark against lawless power. Men who injure and oppress the people under their administration provoke them to cry out and complain. The brilliant attorney closed by urging the gentlemen of the jury to take up the cause of liberty, telling them that by so doing, they will have baffled the attempt of tyranny. The 7 jury members were convinced by Hamilton's impassioned speech and found Zenger not guilty. Discharged from prison the next day, Zenger returned to his printing business, publishing the transcripts of his own trial. While colonial officials were reluctant to accept the case's ruling on the definition of libel, the case became famous throughout the American colonies. and once the colonists had thrown off England's royal rule and established a new republic. The nation's founding fathers codified the Zenger Trials ruling in the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution guarantees freedom of press.
Troops begin fighting in World War II?
Late in 1942, the United States sent its first troops across the Atlantic, making amphibious landings in North Africa, followed by Sicily and the Italian peninsula. The first Allied landings were in Morocco, Casablanca, and Algeria, Oran and Algiers, on November 8 of that year. Algiers became the Allied headquarters in North Africa for the duration of the war. The combined forces of the initial landing included more than 100,000 troops, launching the American military effort in the Atlantic theater of conflict. One American newspaper headline announced, "Yanks invade Africa." Was the U.S.
Why was the development of the quantum theory important?
German physicist and professor Max Planck, 1858 to 1947, originated and developed the quantum theory. From 1900, for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1918. The basic theory is that energy and some other physical properties can exist in tiny, finite amounts, called quanta. Before Planck's work, theories of classical physics held that energy and physical properties varied continuously. Planck experimented with blackbody radiation. A black body is any substance that absorbs all of the radiant energy that falls on it, reflecting none of it. He concluded that radiant energy can be divided, and the particles, quanta, would have values proportional to those of the energy source. Planck determined the relationship between the amount of energy that light has and its frequency. Along with Albert Einstein's, 1897 to 1955, theory of relativity. The quantum theory forms the basis of modern physics. Since it was developed, the quantum theory has been applied to numerous processes involving the transfer of energy in an atomic or molecular scale, including in 1913 when it was used by Danish physicist and Nobel laureate, 1922, Niels Bohr, 1885 to 1962, to explain atomic structure. The theory has been used to explain how electrons move through the chips in a personal computer, the decay of nuclei, and how lasers work.
Where does golf sensation Tiger Woods rank among the greats?
Woods, 1975, ranks among the best players of all time. In 1999 he won 8 tournaments, including the Professional Golfers Association, PGA, and Tour Championships, and he was the first player to win 4 consecutive starts since Ben Hogan. 1912 to 1997. In 1953, Hogan won a total of 5 tournaments that year. In 2000 Woods went on to win 9 tournaments, and in 2001 and 2002 he had 5 wins each season, giving him a total of 27 wins in 4 years. In July 2005, with his victory at the British Open, Woods became only the 5th player in golf history to complete a career Grand Slam, winning golf's 4 major tournaments: the Masters, the US Open, the British Open, and the PGA Championship. In 2001 he became the first player to consecutively win the Grand Slam. This impressive run alone assures Woods a place in the annals of golf history. As of mid-2005, Arnold Palmer, 1929, remained the PGA leader for the number of wins in any 4-year period. Between 1960 and 1964 he racked up 29 first-place finishes. He was also the first player to win the Masters 4 times, 1958, 1960, 1962, and 1964. A couple of other legendary names in golf tallied record numbers of wins in short periods to dominate the sport. Ben Hogan won 30 tournaments in 3 seasons, 1946-48, and Byron Nelson, 1912. Won 26 tournaments in just 2 years, 1944 and 1945. Sam Snead, 1912-2002, and Jack Nicklaus, 1940. Dominated the sport over the course of decades. Snead holds the record for the most wins in a career, 81. And Nicklaus follows with 71. At the age of 24, Woods was already the PGA's career earnings leader. To put this in perspective, in 1999 he won $1 million more for the year than golf legend Jack Nicklaus made in his entire PGA Tour career. Woods' ability and appeal combined to help raise earnings overall for the sport. He was credited with expanding golf's horizons by bringing new fans to the game. According to ESPN, the magazine, ratings for the final round of each of the 4 majors collectively jumped 56% in 1997 when Woods broke the Masters scoring record. He shot 270 over 72 holes to finish 12 strokes ahead of the second-place winner. At the end of the 2004 season, and despite a slump, Woods remained on top for career earnings. But he was followed very closely by Vijay Singh, 1963.
How did the British come to control much of North America during colonial times?
British and French explorers laid claim to many parts of what is now the United States. During the late 1600s and into the mid-1700s, the 2 European powers fought a series of 4 wars in their struggle for control of territory in North America. 3 of the wars broke out in Europe before they spread to America, where British and French colonists fought King William's War. 1689-97, Queen Anne's War, 1702-13, and King George's War, 1744-48. King William's War saw no gains for either side. After Queen Anne's War, however, both sides signed the Treaty of Utrecht, in which France ceded Newfoundland, Acadia, and the Hudson Bay Territory to Britain. The struggle between England and France was not settled until a fourth war, the French and Indian War, 1754–63, from which Britain emerged the victor.
What happened to Athens after the Peloponnesian War?
At the same time that Athens was under attack from Sparta, the city-state also suffered a terrible plague, beginning in 430 B. C. The plague killed about a third of Athens' citizens. This contributed to Athens' eventual defeat at the hands of its Spartan rivals during the Peloponnesian War. After the plague had claimed so many lives, Athens simply couldn't muster the military leadership and strength that it needed to defeat the increasingly powerful Peloponnesian League. At the end of the fighting, in 404 BC, Athens was in ruins. Sparta became the dominant city-state in the Greek world. But conflicts continued among the city-states, and Thebes eventually defeated Sparta in 371 BC. As a result of the ongoing warfare, the Greek economic conditions declined, and the gap between rich and poor widened. The public spirit that had been the hallmark of the golden age of Greece disappeared. In short, the city-states were no longer the glorious entities they had once been. While the Greek city-states were in decline, Greece's neighbor to the north, Macedonia, was growing more powerful. In 353 BC, Macedonian King Philip II, 382–336 BC, launched an attack on Greece. The war that resulted did not end until 338 BC, when Greece was finally conquered. The Macedonian victory was only the first part of Philip's plans. He believed a combined Macedonian-Greek army could defeat the powerful Persians. But he was not to see this happen. When Philip was killed by a Macedonian in 336 BC, he was succeeded by his 20-year-old son, Alexander, 356–323 BC, a man history would come to call the Great. Alexander carried out his father's plan to invade Persia. And 2 years after Philip's death, Alexander began a 10-year campaign that ultimately conquered the Persian Empire. By the time he was 30 years old, Alexander had conquered much of the known world, expanding his empire from Egypt to India.
President, how long must women wait for liberty?
And, more radically, Kaiser Wilson, 20 million American women are not self-governed. Their intent was to expose the government's hypocrisy. In April, the United States had entered World War I. 1914–18, in an effort to guarantee democracy abroad. Yet democracy did not exist at home where the entire female population remained disenfranchised. In June, police began arresting demonstrators on minor charges, such as obstructing traffic. But the arrests did nothing to deter the suffragists. Upon their release from prison, they returned to protest at the White House gates. In all, 168 women, including Alice Paul, 1885 to 1977, and Lucy Burns, 1879 to 1966, of the National Woman's Party, were arrested. On the night of November 14, 1917, guards took 33 protesters to the Occoquan workhouse to be held. Previously, the women had been subject to forced feedings and solitary confinement at Occoquan. But this time new cruelties awaited them. They were beaten, dragged, choked, and handcuffed. Word leaked out about the atrocities committed at the workhouse. Less than 2 weeks later, a judge ruled that the women had been brutally treated. Yet they had done nothing more than exercise their constitutional right to free speech. The women returned to their fight, now with more weight of public opinion behind them. Nevertheless, it was 3 long years before the 19th Amendment was adopted, guaranteeing women the right to vote. In 1982, a historical marker was placed on the prison grounds in tribute to the brave women who endured Occoquan's Night of Terror.
Why did the United States get involved in the Korean War?
Americans became involved in the Korean conflict when the United Nations, UN, only 5 years old, called upon member countries to give military support to South Korea, which had been invaded by troops from communist-ruled North Korea on June 25, 1950. The United Nations considered the invasion to be a violation of international peace and called on the communists to withdraw. When they did not, 16 countries sent troops and some 40 countries sent supplies and military equipment to the aid of the South Korean armies. About 90% of the Union aid came from the United States. But North Korea received aid too. The Chinese sent troops and the Soviet Union provided equipment for them to sustain the war, which lasted until July 27, 1953. After 3 years of fighting, an armistice was called, but a formal peace treaty was never drawn up between the neighboring countries, prompting the United States to maintain military forces in South Korea in an effort to discourage any further acts of aggression from the North.
When did MTV first air?
Music television, MTV, made its debut August 1, 1981. When it was made available to 2.1 million cable-subscribing households in the United States. The format was all music, 24 hours a day. Audiences could tune in any time to watch popular rock artists performing hit songs. The notion of pairing music with video was not without precedent. The most obvious of which is the Beatles' 1964 critically acclaimed pseudo-documentary, A Hard Day's Night. What was new was the idea of airing music videos around the clock. MTV was the brainchild of John Lack, vice president of Warner Amex Satellite Entertainment, which owned the cable station Nickelodeon. He'd taken interest in the Nickelodeon program Pop Clips, a music and video show developed by Michael Nesmith, a former member of the pop group The Monkees. Lack thought the format had potential, and soon a young executive, Robert Pittman, just 27 years old, was given charge of the project. MTV was launched with 13 advertisers and a meager library of only 125 videos, all provided by the record labels. But MTV caught on, and by 1984 it had captured an audience of more than 24 million viewers, was showing a profit, and was soon spun off into a separate company by parent company Warner. The video colossus thrived during the 1980s, helping launch more than a few music careers. However, in the following decade VJs, video jockeys, had to make way for alternate programming on the music channel in order to keep audiences interested. In addition to the standard video programs, including theme shows such as Yo! MTV Raps, the cable channel broadened its offerings to include specials. MTV Spring Break and MTV Video Music Awards, as well as series such as Real World, Road Rules, and The Osbournes. All of the new programming was aimed at the Generation X audience, the very group of teens and 20-somethings who, in the 1990s, couldn't remember not watching MTV. Even though its audience was estimated to have declined by more than half since its peak, MTV remained a going and profitable concern into the 2000s. As advertisers continued to rely on the medium to reach the youth market.
Why did Andrew Johnson vow he would burn Nashville before surrendering it?
It seems a strange thing for a politician to say about his home state's capital city. Andrew Johnson had served Tennessee in both the U.S. House of Representatives 1843-53 and the U.S. Senate 1857-62. He had also been governor 1853-57. But after the Civil War broke out, the Southern Democrat made a surprising move. He sided with the Union. This show of allegiance was largely owing to Johnson's strongly held belief that the South's secession was unconstitutional. Having thus made his stand, President Abraham Lincoln, 1809-1865, saw fit to appoint Johnson as the Union's military governor in Tennessee. When rebel forces surrounded Nashville and seemed poised to take it, Johnson proclaimed he would sooner burn the city before surrendering it. But he was forced to do neither. In mid-December 1864 Union forces used the hand-cranked Gatling gun, invented in 1861, to help defeat the Confederate forces.
What did lawmakers do to resolve the slavery question before the Civil War?
The mid-1800s were a trying time for the nation. The divide widened between the northern free states and the southern slave states, which were growing increasingly dependent on agricultural slave labor. Government tried but was unable to bring resolution to the conflict over slavery. Instead, its efforts seemed geared toward maintaining the delicate North-South political balance in the nation. After the Mexican War, 1846–48, the issue was front and center as congressmen considered whether slavery should be extended into Texas and the Western Territories. Gained in the peace treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which officially ended the war. Lawmakers arrived at the Compromise of 1850, which proved a poor attempt to assuage mounting tensions. The legislation allowed for Texas to be admitted to the Union as a slave state, California to be admitted as a free state. Slavery was prohibited, voters in New Mexico and Utah to decide the slavery question themselves. A method called popular sovereignty, the slave trade to be prohibited in Washington, D.C., and for passage of a strict fugitive slave law to be enforced nationally. 4 years later, as it considered how to admit Kansas and Nebraska to the Union, Congress reversed an earlier decision, part of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, that had declared the territories north of the Louisiana Purchase to be free, and set up a dangerous situation in the new states. The slavery status of Kansas and Nebraska would be decided by popular sovereignty, the voters in each state. Nebraska was settled mostly by people opposing slavery, but settlers from both the North and the South poured into Kansas, which became the setting for violent conflicts between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. Both sides became determined to swing the vote by sending squatters to settle the land. Conflicts resulted, with most of them clustered around the Kansas border with Missouri, where slavery was legal. In one incident, on May 24, 1856, ardent abolitionist John Brown, 1800–1859, led a massacre in which 5 pro-slavery men were brutally murdered as they slept. The act had been carried out in retribution for earlier killings of freemen at Lawrence, Kansas. Brown claimed his was a mission of God. Newspapers dubbed the series of deadly conflicts, which eventually claimed more than 50 lives, Bleeding Kansas. The situation proved that neither congressional compromises nor the doctrine of popular sovereignty would solve the nation's deep ideological differences.